Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. This is written in 1894. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So just real briefly, what kind of trouble does Mrs. Mallard have? Heart trouble. There we go. It was her sister, Josephine, who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half-concealing her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He'd only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. So in your Google Doc that I already told you to get out, I want you to list the characters that we know of so far, and also, how did Mrs. Mallard's husband die? Who are the characters? Start back here. Yeah, go ahead.
Sister, friend, Miss Miller, and the husband.
Okay.
I got Miss Miller, Josephine Richards, and Brentley Mallard.
Yeah, Brentley Mallard, which is Mrs. Mallard's husband, who supposedly passed away. Okay. And then what did Mr. Mallard pass away from? Yeah, a railroad accident. Very good. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one to follow her. There stood facing the open window a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. Have you ever wept so hard that you just exhausted, everything is taken out of you?
I left so hard that happened to me.
In this case, she wept. She had nothing left, and she sank into her armchair. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song, which someone was singing, reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west, facing her window. So think about this. Her husband just died, a really horrible death, might I add, a railroad disaster. And we know she wept, we know she was sad, but it's the one she committed her life to, remember, okay? I want to ask you the question, why would Chopin, which is the author, right? Why would Kate Chopin portray a happy setting with new spring life? I mean, you've got birds chirping, you've got patches of blue sky, that smell, that fragrance of rain is in the distance. I mean, you almost get like a spring setting, a spring atmosphere that she's getting. Let's start back here.
Maybe, or trying to interpret that, not everything is so bad. Even though he just walks over very dear to you, that everything's gonna be okay.
Okay. Despite there being death, maybe, hey, this life's still all right. Okay. Let's go right here.
What I think is that she's trying to tell the person it's okay and try to get it off your mind.
Okay. Okay. So maybe Chopin is portraying a setting where everything's going to be okay. And maybe this setting kind of helps her.
You said Chopin.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you said Chopin.
I said Chopin, Kate Chopin. That's funny. It does sound like show hands, right? Very good. Show me your hands. Show me your hands. All right, very good. Let's continue. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. She was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. I want you to write another thing in your Google Doc. Mrs. Mallard says the phrase, free, free, free. She says it 3 times. In addition, her body has become more relaxed. Her pulse is even beating faster. I want you to write down what you feel these descriptions indicate. Okay? Write down what you feel these descriptions indicate. Why does she say free, free, free? Why is her pulse beating faster? Why does she feel relaxed? Okay, maybe she's going to kill herself. What about this indicates to you that perhaps she's suicidal?
She's saying free, and her pulse is beating fast.
What does the pulse have to do with
I
suicide?
don't know, maybe she's hyped up, adrenaline rush.
Okay, adrenaline. All right, right here, Dusty.
I don't think that she's suicidal. I think that kind of, they didn't go as calmly as what they thought they would, and I think that's kind of hitting her now, and that's kind of sending her into a state of she's dying herself, and that's her way of interpreting what death feels like. So she's kind of starting to, she's dying too.
Okay, so the whispered words of freedom and the increased pulse rate, and this relaxed feeling. You feel maybe she's dying herself. How many times does that happen when a husband or wife passes away? Seems like the other one passes away shortly after, especially in older age. Let's go back here, and then is your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go here and then here.
Okay, what if she's possessed? Just a thought. What if she's possessed?
Maybe she's possessed. It's a possibility, right? Let's go right here.
What I said was that she stopped crying and probably saw the husband's ghost.
Maybe saw the husband's what?
Ghost.
Maybe saw the ghost. Okay. We saw that in our last short story. I mean, they weren't actual ghosts. They thought they were ghosts. Maybe in this short story, she actually sees the ghost. Believe it or not, the increased pulse rate, the whispered words of freedom, okay, and this relaxed feeling actually indicates there is a sense of thrill for Mrs. Mallard. Okay? There's a sense of thrill and adrenaline for Mrs. Mallard. Yes?
So she's happy to be free from her husband, like the marriage and stuff. Like they could have a bad relationship.
Those words of freedom and the increased pulse rate, that relaxed feeling, the spring in the air, is all portraying a sense of thrill for Mrs. Mallard. Believe it or not.
So maybe she's just like, I got to this grumpy dude wanting to make his porridge. He gotta be like, hey, I want a porridge, woman. Okay, but eat your porridge, it's getting cold.
Okay. Have you ever? I know this is a married couple and they're older. I'm not saying like real old. You know what I'm saying? But in the same sense, have you known people who've gotten out of relationships and they're like, oh my gosh, free, free, free. And their pulse is beating and they're relaxed and they're the happiest they've ever been.
This goes back to the 1890s, so I mean, like the older men marry younger women sometimes that and they don't want to be married. Older men stirs that.
Maybe the younger women don't want to be married to the older man. Yeah, we aren't given their exact age, in this. But
I
in
know
this,
the story says 1894.
1894, yeah, that's when it was written. But these are fictional characters. They're not real life characters. This is just characters that Chopin has just created herself. So we don't know their exact age, but we do know they were married. Okay, let's continue this, and let's see how and where Chopin takes this sense of thrill for Mrs. Mallard at the news of her husband who passed away. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. So listen, there's actually an internal conflict that is taking place right now. Okay? We see sorrow of her husband's death, and that if she's like, okay, if I see my husband and I see him in his casket and I see his arms folded and his hands tied together, anybody been to a funeral and they see that relaxed dead body there? Okay? She's saying, if I see my husband there, whom I've committed my life to, I'm going to weep again. I know I'll weep when I see him. It's still going to be devastating. But in the same sense, there's this conflict of this thrill that she has of this independent life all on her own. Her husband just died. She just wept. She sank into her chair from exhaustion. But then she looks out the window with this spring setting and she holds out her arms, talking about her freedom. She welcomes, she embraces this moment. of her female independence. Let's continue. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet, she had loved him. Sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? So love compared to the thrill and power of being in complete control of one's life. She's like, I loved him. Well, sometimes. But then she's like, what did it matter? And she starts thinking about this life of independence, of freedom, all on her own. You see what she's contemplating right here?
She's having a weird moment right
A
now.
weird moment?
Yeah.
That's a good description. I think that's pretty accurate. Here it is again. Here's this resounding statement that she says, free, body and soul, free. She kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Let me in, let me in. Who's Josephine again?
Her sister.
The sister, very good. Luis, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Luis? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I am not making myself ill. No. She was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. In other words, she's like, I'm not sick.
I'm doing good.
I'm the opposite of sick. You're right. I'm doing well. I'm healthy. I'm actually looking out the window right now with my arms spread open, embracing this independent life as a female. I'm not sick, sister. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. We had a prediction that she was suicidal. She now prays to God that life might be long. And it was just a moment ago, it was just before the news of her husband, that she was afraid that life actually might be too long. You see what's going through this woman's head?
She's not a great life.
And like you said, she's doing good. She's the opposite of suicidal.
She's probably a start. Like, she's probably like 8 minutes. Oh, wait, no, it's 18. That's
1894, yeah. Now, shall we read the exciting conclusion?
No.
Yay.
Let's do it. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. Her husband just died, and she's walking around with swag, all right? She's like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. Who might it be? It was Brentley Mallard who entered. A little travel stain, composedly carrying his gripsack, an umbrella, kind of like a briefcase, coming back from his business trip.
So she's dead.
He had been far from the scene of the accident
Oh, I thought she died. She was
and did not even know there had been one. Did he die?
No.
Her husband never even died. He comes back from his business trip, says he's been far from the accident. He was never even close to this railroad disaster that took place.
Now she's sad.
Wait, was he a railroad worker?
No, he's in a business.
He was on a business trip and said that he died in a railroad disaster. Last little paragraph. Here it is. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry. Ah! At Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. When the doctors came, They said that she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. Raise your hand right now if you think that Mrs. Mallard died because she was just so overjoyed, as the doctors alluded to see her husband alive, of joy that kills. Okay? Okay? Raise your hand now if you think Mrs. Mallard died due to shock and disappointment.
I thought she had like
She was
excited like her pulse
She was so happy.
I thought she got like so excited that like her heart
She
was
died
like,
smiling.
Yeah, let's go one at a time. One at a time. Look back at that second little section. Shh. Look back at that second little section right before that last one. It says he had been far from the scene of the accident, did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry. So her sister, what? She cried. She had that piercing little screech, all right? And then Richard's, right, who we talked about at the beginning, Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. So Richard's knowing what about Mrs. Mallard? No, Mrs. Mallard. That's right. Mrs. Mallard had a heart condition, and so Richard's, they'd already broke the news to her that her husband had passed away. And so if she sees her husband, who she thought was dead, alive right in front of her, is that going to be good for her heart?
No.
And so Richards dives in front of her to block the view because he knows that she could have a heart attack, right? As we had in that very first paragraph of the short story. And the doctors come in, they see her dead, and Chopin jumps right to the story, the end of the story. They diagnosed her. They said that she had died of what?
Joy.
Of joy. Oh, obviously, she saw her husband. She got so excited. She got so overjoyed at seeing her husband that she just fell over dead. It's that heart trouble. She died of joy that kills. That's one of the most famous endings of any short story you'll ever read. Of joy that kills. It's such a famous phrase that Kate Chopin really made famous. Okay? Again, the question, did the doctors get it right in saying they didn't?
How do you tell someone died of joy? Just the blood pressure?
They made the false assumption that she was overjoyed at seeing her husband, which that makes sense, right?
No.
To see your husband, who you thought passed away, just like the war widow, right? If she had seen her husband, you think she would experience joy? Absolutely.
She'd be kind of freaked out. Think about it.
But
Do you
also
think,
that-
hey, hold on, seriously though, do you think she would be joyous in seeing her husband whom she loved?
Yeah.
I guess. I'd be freaked out. You know, someone
Yeah, the answer is
like,
yes.
whoa.
Obviously we'd be freaked out. The answer is yes, right? That's the most common response at seeing your husband, especially when you find out he's still with you. He gets to spend, you get to spend your lives together. That's the common response, all right? But everything in this short story indicates that she was excited at that life of female independence the rest of her life. She saw her husband and she died of shock and disappointment. You're absolutely right.
She died of happiness.
She died of shock and disappointment at seeing her husband, who she did not want to even be alive with her.
At first, yes. She was happy now.
So she was happy and then
She was happy that he
yeah,
was
then he said,
Yeah, she was happy because she was going to live life on her own. And then she sees her husband returning, that he never died. And she was disappointed. And as a result, she was so disappointed, she was so shocked
Relationship.
that her heart trouble.
Then that must have been a bad relationship.